In our last episode, we examined the root causes of the Great Depression and identified two of the key people involved in the crime, the chairman of the New York Federal Reserve, Benjamin Strong, and the governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman. Strong and Norman conspired with one another and with the acquiescence of their respective governments to inflate both the British pound and the American dollar. It was this inflation, we determined, that created the boom that was the Roaring Twenties, and that inevitably led to the bust that was the depressing 30s. The inflation led to a speculative frenzy of bad investment that could not profitably be sustained. The investors themselves and the market as a whole were blameless for this crime, as they were victims just like everyone else outside the small circle of bankers and political insiders who got away with the loot. But our investigation is not over. In previous crimes like this, the pain was over relatively quickly. The malinvestments were liquidated in bankruptcies, and the painful unemployment ended within a year or two at the most. But not this time. This time the agony went on for more than a decade. In fact, here we had a depression within a depression, and capped it all off with a world war. What's more, Strong had departed the scene, having died before the crash hit, so he could not be held responsible for the second depression. Besides, perhaps he played a key role in causing the crisis, but he now had a pretty good alibi. He was dead. For the second crime, we must find other suspects. Before the Great Depression of the 1930s, there had been a not-so-great depression in 1920-1921. Ever heard of it? Probably not. While very severe, it lasted less than a year, and the recovery was so robust that historians pretty much forgot about it. But it was severe. From 1920 to 1921, the estimated gross national product, or the estimated value of all goods and services produced in the United States, plunged 24%, from $91.5 billion to $69.6 billion. During that same period, the number of unemployed people jumped from 2.1 million to 4.9 million, or roughly 12% of the workforce. Home and farm foreclosures and bank failures spiraled, and calls for federal relief came from every corner of America. What was different from the collapse of the 1930s was the response of the politicians, specifically Warren Harding, the president. Harding understood that depressions were the unavoidable result of speculative bubbles created by monetary inflation. As Harding explained, there will be depression after inflation, just as surely as the tide ebbs and flows. The painful liquidation of unsound money and unsound businesses created by Woodrow Wilson's foolish intervention in World War I was not only unavoidable but necessary if the economy was ever to return to a sustainable path. Rather than provide federal relief to the suffering or encourage more inflation in a futile effort to keep the wartime boom going, Harding urged Congress to reduce both government spending and taxation. This, Harding reasoned, would quickly bring the necessary corrections, return capital to the marketplace, and give consumers real relief by allowing them to keep more of the money they had earned and save and spend it as they wished. The results were astounding. By 1922, GNP had recovered to $74.6 billion, and unemployment fell by nearly 50% to 2.8 million, 6.7% of the workforce. By 1926, with Harding's Vice President Calvin Coolidge in the White House, unemployment had fallen even further to 1.8%, the lowest rate ever recorded in peacetime. Unfortunately, behind the scenes, Benjamin Strong and the Federal Reserve were already in the process of inflating yet another monetary bubble. President Herbert Hoover had the terrible misfortune to be the man in the White House when that next bubble burst, and the next recession broke upon the nation. As we know, the Federal Reserve, under the leadership of Benjamin Strong, identified in Episode 1 as the main culprit in our story, had been quietly inflating us into the Roaring Twenties for the previous 5 years. As a result of this inflation, the stock market had been rising rapidly. Money had to go somewhere. This inflation triggered rampant speculation that drove stock prices even higher. Abnormally low interest rates made buying stock and other things on credit easy, and an economic boom ensued. The danger in this situation was that if the price increase ever reversed, margin calls, or demands by the bankers for immediate payment of their stock loans, would trigger forced sales and drive prices lower, wiping out investors. Unable to collect on their outstanding loans, the banks would then follow the debtor investors down the financial toilet. Panic then would set in among bank depositors. Fearful that the insolvent banks were losing the money they had deposited there, depositors would rush to withdraw their cash, which of course the banks did not have. These were called bank runs. This all came to pass beginning in late October of 1929, and none of this was Herbert Hoover's fault. He had only been president for a few months and had no formal control over monetary policy. That was in the hands of Mr. Strong, our little man behind the curtain. There was much to pity about poor President Hoover. Coming into office, he was widely admired. Part of the first graduating class in the newly opened Stanford University, Hoover had distinguished himself early in his political career by leading the effort to bring much-needed food to the starving people of Central Europe during and after World War I. He then served as Secretary of Commerce under both Presidents Harding and Coolidge. When Coolidge chose not to seek another term as president, Hoover was the logical nominee for his party. He easily beat Democratic Party nominee Al Smith in the 1928 presidential election. When it came to responding to the stock market crash and ensuing depression, however, Hoover's response was far from enlightened. Rather than learning from the experience of his late boss, Warren Harding, Hoover did just the opposite of what Harding did under similar circumstances 9 years earlier. He called on Congress to provide federal aid to struggling businesses with his Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and he signed a huge tax increase into law to pay for this relief. He tried to organize farmers with his Federal Farm Board. The Farm Board tried to prop up prices, which typically fall during a recession as part of the necessary process of liquidating malinvestments. Hoover signed into law the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which taxed imports and slowed down global trade, and he also signed the Norris-LaGuardia Act that empowered big labor unions to strike, thus raising wages for some but reducing overall employment for everyone else. All these actions merely prolonged the agony and prevented the economy from recovering. 4 years of flailing around trying one intervention or experiment and then another came to nothing. In fact, Hoover's policies only made things worse. By Hoover's last year in office, almost 1/4 of the entire American workforce was jobless. Angry World War I veterans marched on Washington, demanding payment of bonuses promised them by the federal government, but they were driven away by Army troops. The spectacle of U.S. Army troops attacking hungry veterans, some of them disabled from the war, in the nation's capital further embarrassed the president and destroyed his reputation. The prosecution submits in evidence government expenditures under Herbert Hoover. The jury will note that government spending under Hoover increased by more than 25%, even as government revenues fell during the recession. Under Hoover, the federal government began running significant deficits that would have to be financed by borrowing, further draining the already struggling private economy of available credit. These are hardly the budgets of a frugal advocate of laissez-faire economics. In the face of a dramatic recession, Hoover did just the opposite of Harding. The above tax schedules show the dramatic increase in marginal tax rates during Hoover's last year in office. Taxes more than doubled on most incomes, draining the American people of the means of pulling themselves out of the recession. Saving, investing, and spending all dried up, so much so that despite the higher rates, or rather because of the higher rates, government revenues actually fell. The total effect of Hoover's policies was to both deepen and lengthen the recession, turning it into the Great Depression. Hoover's Democratic Party opponent in the 1932 presidential election called Hoover's policy of deficit spending reckless and extravagant. The name of that opponent, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the next man to stand in the dock. Widely regarded as the man who rescued America from the Depression, he in fact greatly aggravated the Depression, and then to cover his tracks, dragged America into the Second World War. We are referring to none other than the sainted Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Amazingly, despite a record of total failure and perfidy, he was re-elected 3 times to the White House, finally dying there in 1945. The prosecution will demonstrate that FDR, while campaigning as a fiscal conservative favoring less government spending and lower taxes, once in office outdid even Mr. Hoover, whom he criticized during the campaign for irresponsible spending. You will note here in Prosecution Exhibit 1 that in Mr. Roosevelt's first year in office, federal spending went up by a further $1.9 billion, while taxes went up by $1 billion. This on top of already huge increases in both taxes and spending by Mr. Hoover. The federal deficit thus increased to a record $3.6 billion. I suppose compared to Mr. Roosevelt, Hoover does appear to be quite stingy, but again, both Hoover and Roosevelt presided over massive tax and spending increases. They are both guilty. Mr. Roosevelt referred to his program as the New Deal, but it was really just a massive expansion of Hoover's Old Deal. As you can also see from Prosecution Exhibit 3, the unemployment rate, while peaking during FDR's first year in office, never went below double digits until the United States entered the Second World War as a combatant. Even the apparent decrease from the 1933 peak is misleading. The New Deal only increased government employment with such boondoggles make-work programs as the Work Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps, and then finally with the ultimate wasteful make-work program, war. Roosevelt did nothing to revive the productive private civilian economy, which remained stuck in the doldrums throughout FDR's unprecedented 12 years in office. And why was this? The prosecution recalls Professor von Mises to the stand. As Professor von Mises explained earlier in Episode 1, in the trial of Governors Benjamin Strong and Bank of England Governor Montague Norman, recessions are caused by monetary inflation. The artificially low interest rates created by inflation create unsustainable malinvestments. While these malinvestments give the temporary appearance of prosperity or create a boom in the economy, they must eventually be liquidated in a recession, or a bust of the economy. Like a drunk or a drug addict that has gone on a binge, the economy must endure the inevitable hangover or withdrawal pains from such irresponsibility. President Harding understood this in 1920. He allowed the economy to sleep it off, providing only the tonic of tax cuts and government spending cuts. Within a year, the real economy was growing again. Where both Mr. Hoover and Mr. Roosevelt went wrong is in trying to prolong the binge, to keep the economy on a permanent high, or more accurately, in a stupor. It could not be done, and the patient only got sicker and sicker. Raising taxes and increasing government spending only bled the economy of resources, diverting them into wasteful projects. The wastefulness of these projects becomes apparent when one considers that the private profit-driven marketplace had not funded them previously. Perhaps having more roads, bridges, parks, and other public works is nice, but so are many other things. In a world of scarce resources, consumers must choose among many alternatives. When the government taxes away investor and consumer income, and then arbitrarily or politically makes the choices for consumers, consumers are made worse off, and certainly no one would have chosen war as a way to spend scarce resources. Only governments can be so foolish. War creates employment, yes, and makes the economic statistics, such as GDP, bounce upward, but only at the cost of deep deprivation and destruction. Rationed meat, butter, sugar, cloth, and just about every other useful commodity can hardly be called prosperity, no matter how many hours one is working. World War II only aggravated the pain the patient was already in. Besides the wasteful spending and taxation needed to pay for it, the Roosevelt administration also continued and expanded Hoover's programs to regulate or restrict the free market. While Hoover had his Reconstruction Finance Corporation and Federal Farm Board, Roosevelt created the National Recovery Administration and National Labor Relations Board. In creating these regulatory agencies, Roosevelt was not just copying the style of the fascist dictators in Europe. Note the socialist realist style of the NRA and WPA posters on this slide, but their substance as well. Just as in Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, the goal of the New Deal was to organize American businesses into government-controlled cartels and to organize workers into labor unions that would also ultimately ally themselves with the state and serve its purposes. The NRA attempted to do the deed with business, and the Wagner Act, or National Labor Relations Act, was intended to help organize the workers. As with all such arrangements, it was never really clear who was controlling who, but one thing was certain. The American consumers and individual workers were left out altogether. Under both Hoover and Roosevelt, the free market was starved and crippled by the crushing twin burdens of taxes and regulations, and then finally, the burden of war. So what did finally bring recovery? How did we get out of the mess? Two things: the death of FDR and the end of the Second World War. Of the two, the end of the war was critical. While some economists suggested that all the soldiers coming home would mean a return of unemployment, this was not the case. Returning soldiers often started businesses, and these new businesses employed millions and, more importantly, built useful products and provided useful services demanded by consumers, and not by the government. With the death of FDR and the resurgence of a more pro-market Republican Party in Congress, many of the worst elements of FDR's New Deal were dismantled. One key element of this was the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. That stripped big labor unions of some of their power and restored employer and individual worker rights, at least to a limited extent. The NRA had been struck down as unconstitutional in 1934, but it was effectively imposed anyway by the war. With the war's end, government control of industry was finally dismantled and the free market allowed to work. It was peace and freedom that finally brought genuine recovery.